December 3, 1943. Copenhagen, Denmark. The knock came at 5:17 in the morning. Anna Fredriksson opened the door to find 3 German soldiers standing in the dim light of the stairwell, their breath steaming in the frozen air. One held a list. Another gripped a rifle. The third simply stared at her with the flat, rehearsed indifference of a man who had done this many times before. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stepped back as they entered her home, boots echoing on the wooden floor, and pointed to her coat hanging by the door. They were taking women all over the city that morning, and no one would speak of it for decades. Before we go further into this untold chapter of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community dedicated to preserving the voices that were silenced, the stories that were buried, and the truths that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's Denmark, Germany, America, or anywhere else in the world. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Let's continue. The truck that carried Anna through the streets of Copenhagen was open-backed, canvas-covered, cold as a tomb. She sat pressed between 12 other women, none of them speaking, all of them shivering. Some were still in nightgowns beneath their coats. Others clutched handbags they grabbed instinctively, as if identification papers and a comb might somehow protect them. The city outside looked peaceful. Street lamps glowed softly. A baker unlocked his shop. A man on a bicycle pedaled past without looking up. Denmark had been occupied for more than 3 years by then, and the population had learned a terrible skill: the ability to not see. And in that moment, as the truck turned a corner and the women realized no one was coming to help them, they understood something far worse than fear. They understood abandonment. The occupation of Denmark was unlike any other in Nazi-controlled Europe. It began on April 9, 1940. When German forces crossed the border and occupied the entire country in less than 6 hours, there was no grand battle, no prolonged siege. The Danish government, outnumbered and outgunned, chose cooperation over carnage. King Christian X remained on his throne. The parliament continued to function. For the first 3 years, life in Denmark appeared almost normal. Cafes stayed open. Newspapers were published. The Nazis called it a model protectorate, a showcase of occupation without oppression. But beneath that surface, a darker machinery was already turning. By 1943, the illusion had shattered. Resistance networks had begun sabotaging railways, disrupting supply lines, and smuggling Jews to safety in Sweden. The Germans responded with escalating crackdowns. Curfews tightened. Arrests multiplied. And in the winter of that year, a new directive arrived from Berlin: round up women suspected of aiding the resistance or connected to those who did, and use them as leverage. The policy had no official name. No formal documentation survives in Wehrmacht archives, but survivors would later describe it with chilling simplicity. They called it the collection. Anna Fredriksson was 24 years old. She worked as a secretary in a shipping office near the docks. Her only connection to the resistance was her brother, Eric, who had disappeared 6 months earlier after being seen with a radio transmitter. The Germans didn't need proof. Suspicion was enough. On the morning of December 3rd, they came for her and 11 other women from her neighborhood alone. Across Copenhagen, the same scene repeated in dozens of apartments. By noon, more than 60 women had been taken. By the end of the week, that number would exceed 200. They were driven to a converted schoolhouse on the outskirts of the city. The building had once been a place of laughter and learning. Now, its gymnasium had been stripped bare. The basketball hoops still hung from the rafters, but the floor was covered in thin wool blankets arranged in rows. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling. The windows were painted black. When the women were brought inside, they were ordered to stand against the wall, silent, facing forward. A German officer walked slowly behind them, pausing at each woman, inspecting her as though she were livestock at auction. He didn't ask their names. He didn't speak at all. He simply pointed left or right. Those sent to the left were taken downstairs. Those sent to the right remained in the gymnasium. Anna was sent right. Her younger sister Lena, who had been rounded up from a different street, was sent left. Anna never saw her again. The first day was designed to break them. That much became clear within hours. The women in the gymnasium were forced to kneel on the wooden floor for 3 hours without moving. Anyone who shifted her weight was struck across the shoulders with a baton. Anyone who whispered was dragged to the center of the room and made to stand with her arms raised until she collapsed. The Germans did not shout. They did not need to. Their silence was more terrifying than rage. It was methodical, clinical, the kind of cruelty that came not from anger, but from procedure. At midday, they were given food, a single piece of black bread and a tin cup of water. The bread was moldy. The water tasted of rust. But the women ate and drank without complaint, because they understood instinctively that refusal would be met with consequences far worse than hunger. After the meal, they were divided into work groups. Some were ordered to scrub the floors. Others were sent to the basement to clean the rooms where interrogations took place. Anna was assigned to the latter. She descended the stairs with 4 other women, each carrying a bucket and a rag, and entered a space that smelled of sweat, tobacco, and something metallic she couldn't name. The basement had been a locker room. Rusted metal cabinets lined the walls. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a lamp without a shade. The floor was stained. Dark patches spread across the concrete like maps of some unknown, terrible country. Anna was handed a brush and told to scrub. She knelt and began to work, her hands trembling as the cold water soaked through her dress. The other women did the same, none of them speaking, all of them knowing that the stains they were cleaning were someone else's blood. By evening, the reality of their situation had crystallized. This was not a temporary detention. This was not a holding facility where they would be questioned and released. This was something else entirely. The Germans were using them, not for information, not for labor, but as instruments of psychological warfare. The women imprisoned here were sisters, daughters, wives of men suspected of resistance activity. By holding them, the Nazis sent a message to every family in Copenhagen. Your defiance has a price, and we will collect it from those you love. That night, the lights in the gymnasium were turned off at 9 o'clock. The women lay on the floor, wrapped in their thin blankets, shivering in the darkness. Some cried quietly, others prayed. A few simply stared at the ceiling, their eyes open but unseeing, as though they had already left their bodies behind. Anna lay still, listening to the sounds around her, the creak of the building settling, the distant hum of a generator, the muffled footsteps of soldiers pacing the hallways above. And somewhere, far below, a sound she tried desperately not to hear, a woman screaming, her voice cut short by the slam of a door. The days blurred into fear and exhaustion. The women were woken before dawn, forced to clean, cook, or tend wounded German soldiers. The worst part was not the labor, but the uncertainty, never knowing whose name would be called. Some women returned, shaken. Others never returned at all. Interrogations were random, accusations vague. The goal wasn't truth, but fear. And for a time, resistance in Copenhagen slowed. Yet inside the schoolhouse, the women quietly supported one another. Anna learned to survive by focusing on small things, a breath, a memory, a moment of safety, building an inner refuge the Germans couldn't break. On December 19, 1943, 16 days after Anna's arrest, the situation changed. Word spread through the gymnasium that a transport was being prepared. Some of the women would be sent to Germany, to labor camps, to factories, to places whose names they had only heard in whispers. No one knew who would be chosen. No one knew when the trucks would arrive. The women sat in silence, each of them calculating her odds, each of them praying she would not be called. Anna's name was on the list. She learned this from a guard who passed by her work detail and smirked. "Pack your things," he said in broken Danish. "You're going east. She had nothing to pack. Everything she owned, her clothes, her photographs, her life had been left behind in her apartment 17 days ago. She owned only the dress she wore and the blanket she slept on. And now, even those would be taken from her. The transport trucks arrived on the morning of December 21st, 37. Women were loaded into the backs of 3 vehicles, packed so tightly they could barely move. The convoy left Copenhagen just after dawn, heading toward the German border. The journey would take 3 days. The women were given no food, no water, no explanation of where they were going or what awaited them there. They simply sat, pressed against one another, as the truck rumbled south through the frozen Danish countryside. Anna watched through the gap in the canvas as her country disappeared behind her. She saw the spires of churches she had visited as a child. She saw the farmhouses where families still lived, unaware of the convoy passing by. She saw the border crossing into Germany, marked by a simple wooden sign and a line of soldiers who waved the trucks through without inspection. And she realized in that moment that she had left the world she knew behind. Whatever lay ahead was no longer Denmark. It was no longer home. It was something else entirely. Anna arrived at Ravensbrück, the largest women's camp in Nazi Germany. In December 1943, more than 30,000 prisoners were held there. Political detainees, resistance fighters, Jews, and women like Anna, caught by suspicion and proximity. Conditions were brutal: overcrowded barracks, freezing nights, starvation rations, and disease everywhere. Assigned to a textile workshop, Anna worked 12 hours a day sewing Wehrmacht uniforms, her fingers raw, her survival tied to staying useful. She watched women collapse or fade into despair. She refused to join them. She clung to one thing: the hope that her sister Lena was still alive, still holding on. The war began to turn in the spring of 1944. The women in Ravensbrück heard rumors whispered between work shifts, passed from new arrivals who had come from other camps. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany was losing. But for the prisoners, the news brought no comfort. They knew that desperate regimes did desperate things. As the Reich crumbled, the camps became more brutal, not less. Executions increased, rations were cut. Guards became paranoid, violent, unpredictable. Anna survived by becoming invisible. She kept her head down, her voice quiet, her movements efficient. She learned to anticipate the moods of the guards, to sense when danger was near, to navigate the razor-thin line between compliance and defiance. She made no friends. She trusted no one. Survival, she learned, was a solitary act. And yet, in the quiet moments, late at night, when the barracks were dark and the world seemed to pause, she allowed herself to remember. She remembered her mother's voice, her brother's laughter, the smell of the sea near the Copenhagen docks. She remembered what it felt like to be human. And she held on to that memory like a flame in the darkness. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet forces liberated Ravensbrück. By then, the camp was nearly empty. The Germans had evacuated thousands of prisoners in forced death marches, desperate to hide the evidence of their crimes. Those who remained were the sickest, the weakest, the ones too ill to walk. Anna was among them. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her hair had fallen out in clumps. Her body was covered in sores. But she was alive. The Soviet soldiers who entered the camp found scenes beyond comprehension. Piles of bodies. Survivors so emaciated they looked like skeletons. Women who could not speak, could not cry, could not process what had just happened. Liberation did not feel like freedom. It felt like waking from a nightmare into a world that no longer made sense. Anna was taken to a field hospital where doctors worked frantically to save those who could still be saved. She drifted in and out of consciousness for days. When she finally woke, a nurse told her the war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. Anna nodded, but she felt nothing. No relief, no joy. Only a vast, hollow silence. She had survived, But she had also lost everything: her family, her home, her youth, her sense of who she had been before the knock on the door at 5:17 in the morning. It took Anna 6 months to reach Denmark, moving through a Europe still scarred by war. Copenhagen felt smaller, damaged, unfamiliar. Her old apartment was occupied, her workplace turned into a relief center. The schoolhouse where she'd been held now ringing with children's laughter. She never found her sister. Lena's name appeared in no registry. In 1947, Anna was told she was dead. Anna lived quietly as a seamstress near the harbor, never marrying, never speaking of the past. She refused invitations to testify. She wanted peace. Anna Fredriksson died in 1989. Her brief obituary mentioned nothing of what she endured. The story of what happened to Danish women during the German occupation remained largely unspoken for decades. It was not taught in schools. It was not commemorated in memorials. It existed only in the memories of survivors, most of whom chose silence over the pain of reliving trauma. Only in recent years, as historians have unearthed documents and interviewed the last living witnesses, has the full scope of this chapter begun to emerge. Between 1943 and 1945, an estimated 400 Danish women were detained, interrogated, and in many cases deported to camps in Germany. Some were resistance fighters. Others were family members of suspected partisans. Many were guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of those 400, fewer than half survived the war. The rest died in camps, during transports, or in the chaos of the Reich's collapse. Their names are etched on no monument. Their stories are preserved in no museum. They are remembered, if at all, in the whispered recollections of families who lost them. Anna's story is not unique. It is one of thousands. But it is also singular because it reminds us of a truth that history often forgets. War does not only consume soldiers, it consumes the innocent, the bystanders, the women who opened their doors at dawn and never came home. And it consumes them quietly, without fanfare, without recognition, in ways that the world chooses not to see. The knock on Anna's door came at 5:17 in the morning. The world outside looked peaceful. And in that terrible, silent moment, as she stepped back and let the soldiers in, she became one of the invisible casualties of a war that history would remember for its battles, but not for its ghosts.